If we want to understand the natural world, then we need to study biology, chemistry, physics, and understand the laws of those parts of science that govern the natural world. And the same goes for the spiritual world as well. If we want to understand the spiritual world better, then we need to understand the principles and laws of magic that govern that world. So tonight we will be talking about several principles and laws of magic that will help us not only understand the spiritual world better, but will also help us harness those energies around us and within us to a greater degree and will help us amplify our spell work and rituals. So merry meet, I'm Aislin, this is Ask Aislin, and tonight we are here talking about the laws of magic. So welcome, saying hi to those joining us in the chat. I see Glitters in the chat, and Kurt and Joanne is here as well. Merry meet, everyone. And and Jamie is here too. So if you guys are here with us live, we have a Q&A at the end. You can leave questions and comments. It can be about anything related to shadow work, witchcraft, or energy work. And those who are watching back in replay, you guys can leave questions too. And don't forget to leave a heart or a thumbs up somewhere in the video to make sure we get this out to the feed of more people. So Mary Meet, I see Maura joining us in the chat. I see Elizabeth and Rebecca and Andrea is also here. Mary Meet, everyone. So we are going to dive in, and I didn't say this in the intro because I'm undecided about how this episode will go, but there may be too much information here for 1 hour episode. So we're going to see where we get to, and this may end up being, there may end up being a part 2 to this as well. All right. So merry meet, everybody. And I see Kurt had asked if anyone is near Pepperdine. I'm not. It's about 20 miles away. And I see David's also in the chat and Sonia too. Okay, merry meet, everybody. Okay. So let us first start by talking about what is a principle or a law of magic, and then we're at least going to be talking about the 7 Hermetic Principles of Magic tonight. And if time permits, then we'll talk about some other laws of magic, and if it doesn't, then we will have a second episode. So let's first of all, I want to clear up any misconceptions or misunderstanding about the word law, about laws, where this all comes from. So these are underlying principles and frameworks of the spiritual world. They exist within the universe, whether we acknowledge it or not. So it's just kind of like the scientific world. The laws of physics exist, whether you study them and understand and know them or not, they still exist, right? And so the same goes for the magical world. So a magical practitioner, a witch, a pagan who does magic will be able to heighten their ability to perform magic if they understand some of these principles. So these are not human-made laws, which means that they are not connected to any code of morality. So when you think about a human-made law, the laws in your city, in your state, in the country that you live in, these are human-made laws, and some of them have to do with what keeps order within people, right? Groups of people who are living together. And some of the laws also have to do with morality and the system of morality that governs the culture that made the laws. But this is not true for the laws of science and for the laws of magic either. So these are laws that are completely divorced from any morality. They're just simply principles and frameworks that exist whether we know it or not. So, for example, if you think about the natural world, there are laws of physics, and there are, like, for example, Newton's law of gravitation. There's Kepler's laws of planetary motion. And you may have learned about those when you were kids in a science class, and you may have forgotten some of them, but yet they still exist. The world moves around you in this way. And so the same is true for the the spiritual world as well. So the line between magic and science is rather thin, and I think it's always something interesting to talk about. Many of you know I am a science teacher. I teach chemistry and biology and sometimes physics and math. And so I come from a scientific background, and one of the things that I really realize is that this line between what we call science and what we call magic is quite thin, and it's blurry, and it changes over time. And what can be proven also it changes based on the time period that you're living in. So, for example, it was believed at one point in human history that magical forces would enter a person's body and make them sick. Now, we, of course, with the discovery of the microscope, we now know that these are not magical forces. These are bacteria and viruses that enter the body and make us sick. But to a person living at a certain time in human history, these were magical forces. So you can see how things change as the science catches up to the natural world. And another interesting thing that I always think about is the internet. And if you told, like, your great 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 grandparents that someday there would be this ability to press a button and you could send a letter all the way across the world in an instant, they would have told you that that was magic, right? But now we know that it's not. We have the internet. And so to me, science is always catching up with what is already exists within the natural world and the spiritual world as well. So tonight we are going to talk at least about the 7 Hermetic principles. We'll see how far we get, and what you will notice about some of this is that they're found in a variety of introductory witchcraft books, from Bonowitz to Penzac. If you read some kind of a Wicca 101 or a Witchcraft 101 book or a Magic 101 book, you're going to see a lot of these same principles, and you're also going to notice that there's a lot more than the ones that I am going to cover tonight. So what is the difference between a principle and a law? So sometimes when you look in these books, some of what will come up will be noted as principles, and some of it is laws. And honestly, I think a lot of it has to do with where the material comes from and the source. I think that the word principles and laws, when it's used in magic, it's pretty much used pretty interchangeably, but has to do with how the writer notated these frameworks and these systems. So first, the very first that I mentioned we will discuss are the Hermetic Principles. And let's start by talking about where the Hermetic principles come from, what they are, why they're important to us as modern witches. So they are the central concept of the book, and I may not pronounce this correctly, but I think it's Kybalion. It was written in 1908 by 3 initiates, is the name of the author. It is, the students claim to be students of Hermes Trismegistus, at least over time, because Hermes Trismegistus lived much earlier than 1908. Now, he's a historical figure who is associated with both Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And so these principles appear, at least as far as we know, appear hundreds of years ago, maybe not in exactly the same form we'll see them in modern witchcraft books, but they go back a long time into ancient history, which tells us a lot. It tells us about how, our ancient ancestors understood the spiritual world, and how that understanding of the spiritual world still exists today. And of course, we've added on more since then. Now, the first principle that we are going to talk about is the principle of mentalism. And so we'll go through each one, we'll talk about what it is, and then sort of give some examples of it, and then how could a modern witch use it. And then just pausing for a moment to say hi to a few more people who are here. Kurt said there's a big fire. Oh gosh, near Pepperdine, huh? Yeah, it's not too far from where we are, but not close enough that we would be in danger, but it's definitely here in LA. Wow, I hadn't heard about that yet. Merry meet to Tommy as well, and Colleen is also here. And then Glitter was saying mental illness was also considered demonic possession. Yeah, so it's not just the scientific world that, progresses far enough to catch up to the natural and the spiritual world, but it's also, our ideas about mental illness and what is sickness and what is not sickness and where does it come from. Okay, so the principle of mentalism states that everything in the universe is a creation of the all. And so this idea of the all it can be interpreted differently depending on who's doing the interpreting. Now, most of the time, if we're talking to witches, magical practitioners, someone who's in more of a polytheistic pathway, they will tell you that the all is the divine mind, or it's the divine consciousness of the universe. Now, if we dive a little more deeply into the principle, what we start to see is that we are all thoughts within that divine mind. And we perceive ourselves to be separate, but the reality is that we aren't as separate from the rest of the universe as we think that we are. It's in reality, there's really no separation at all, and that separation itself is an illusion. Now, in the Hindu tradition, in the Sanskrit language, that is called Maya. So it is this illusion. It's like a veil that covers our eyes and makes us believe that our separation from everyone else is real. And so when we incarnate, we have to be separated. And part of what many pathways to enlightenment tell us is that moving on a pathway towards enlightenment, we begin to see that illusion, and we begin to see that our separation isn't real, that we only feel separated when we're in a physical body. So as witches, we probably know, like how much bigger our consciousness is than what the confines of the physical, right? How much more expansive the mental is, and the emotional even, and the spiritual. So now, spiritual practices that lead us on a path of evolution, of spiritual evolution and enlightenment, are meant to help us see past that illusion. Now, because the universe is composed of all of us, like all of our thoughts, right? So if the divine mind kind of oversees the universe, and we all also have the ability to think and to create, we connect together inside of the divine mind, inside of the universe. And the universe itself responds to our thoughts because the universe itself is a thought as well. So these are some of the ideas behind the principle of mentalism. But what this means for us as witches is that our thoughts are so powerful, and I'm sure that many of us already know that, right? That we can really change the way that we exist just by changing our thoughts. But also as witches, what we know is that when we project our thoughts out into the universe in the form of intentions, that's really what our magic is. All of the things that we gather, the tools and the candles and the different things that we use to help guide our intentions. But the intention itself is the thing that's actually changing the universe, right? And it's changing it in accordance to our own will, which is what the very definition of magic is. Now, what we also know from the principle of mentalism, that it's not just any thoughts that become manifest. It is thoughts that are infused with intention. So the thoughts, many of the moving thoughts and the fluidity of our thinking, and there are some that will tell us that there are probably 80 to 85% of our thoughts every single day are repetitive, or they're irrelevant, or they're negative. And so these thoughts, which are fleeting, don't have much energy behind them, and so they're just that. They're kind of fleeting, right? But when we have repeated thoughts, or we have thoughts that are infused with intention, those are the ones that have the ability to become manifest. And this is really at the very core of it what magic is. So learning how to project your thoughts in the best way possible is essentially the primary step of learning how to make magic within the principle of mentalism. Now, to understand it a little bit more deeply on a personal level, you can practice projecting your consciousness into the consciousness of another object. So you can project your consciousness into a gemstone or a crystal. You could try projecting your consciousness into or communing your consciousness with a tree or a plant of some kind, or a flower. And so as you learn to really master the ability to project your thoughts out into the universe, this is where you really start to take your magic to the next level. So, and then Jamie said, can we also mention that thoughts are a measurable energy form? And that's absolutely true as well. So there's so much within science that we don't know enough yet. And we're learning all the time, all the time. But yes, thoughts are a measurable energy form and can be measured. So, all right. So, Mary Meet to anybody else joining us. I see Carla and Amy are here, and Tiffany. Mary Meet everybody. Okay, so that was the principle of mentalism. And I would venture to say, as we progress further in science, just like Jamie was mentioning with thoughts being a measurable energy form, we will get better able to measure them. And it won't be like us, just our groups of people who understand this principle. It will be more people. Will be able to understand that there is a reality in the way we can shape the universe with our thinking. Okay, so moving on next to the principle of correspondence. So the principle of correspondence says, as above, so below, and then sometimes we tack on a second part to it. It says, as within, so without. Okay, so let's discuss what that means to us as witches. So this teaches us that the whole contains the part, and that the part also contains the whole. So I feel like this principle builds on the principle of mentalism, because the principle of mentalism tells us that our thoughts can be infused with energy, and it tells us that we have really no separation between ourselves and the divine and between the universe. And so this is sort of an extension of it, is that whatever is here in the existence of this plane also exists in another plane. And so we can kind of think of the universe as being the macrocosm and us within the microcosm. There are cycles and patterns that are repeating infinitely, right, throughout the universe, and they also repeat infinitely throughout our lives. And so this is why, as witches, when we look at the patterns of the seasons, so like for example, we follow the wheel of the year, or we follow the lunar cycles, or perhaps we're actually following other cycles too. We might be following the cycle of the planet Mercury and following the retrogrades, or we might be following the patterns of Chiron, and noticing how that changes things in our own lives. So when we begin to explore these cycles, we become more in tune with the universe, because those cycles are going on around us and they're also going on within us. So, for example, if you think about the structure of the solar system in some ways looks like an atom. Now, we know in science this whole idea of the atom having the nucleus in the center and all the electrons spinning around it on the outside is kind of simplistic. It's not really what we think the atom looks like anymore. But nevertheless, the nucleus is in the center and the electrons are on the outside, which resembles what the universe looks like. All things, of course, are made up of atoms, all living things and non-living things as well, and so therefore, all things contain a map of the cosmos, which is really something that's kind of cool to think about. Now, if we are the microcosm to the macrocosm, this is also similar to the idea of holograms. So a hologram is something that contains an image of the whole in every single piece of it. And what's different about a hologram than something else is, for example, let's say you have a drawing of any type of picture, right? And if you start to rip it up, each little piece that you have is just going to have a piece of that picture, right? But if that picture instead was a hologram and we began to rip it apart and separate it into smaller pieces, each little piece of that hologram is going to contain the entire image. And that is what is so fascinating about this, and really does kind of remind us that this idea of correspondence, this as above, so below, really exists in so many places within the world as well. So one cell, another example, which I always think is very fascinating, is one cell contains all the DNA needed to map out and create the entire body of that organism. Now, the energy that is contained in substances also contains energy that we can use to tap into, and that's also part of what the law of correspondence talks about. So, for example, herbs and stones, planets, colors, deities, archetypes, ritual tools, our list could go on and on and on, but all of these things contain certain types of energy and they correspond to specific energies that exist out in the universe. So, why working with tools and working with things like that can aid people in their magic is kind of twofold, and I'll talk about um, one. I'll talk about one reason, and then the second one, which is a little unrelated to the episode, but one thing behind it is because they contain the energy of that intention. If we stack up those things, like we have certain herbs, we have certain stones, we have a certain tool, we call a certain deity, and if they all resonate with kind of a similar energy, it adds to our own energy and it kind of bulks up the intention. So the reality is, though, if you go back to the principle of mentalism, you don't need any of the correspondences. You just simply need your mind. But the correspondences can help people. Number one, again, it's kind of bulking up, it's stacking the energy. But number two, when people are doubting themselves and there's a lot of like self doubt and lack of self belief and some lack of confidence in their magic, which, by the way, it really does affect way more of us than you think. And you may be thinking like you're the only one that kind of doubts yourself, and I promise you that you are not alone. But the idea using some of these tools can help boost people's confidence. And I don't know, for me, it just makes the magic that much more potent. Do we need the correspondences? No. But can they help us? Absolutely. And so there's always a debate about that, but that is kind of what the law of correspondences means, is that there within our universe there are energies that are contained within all objects, and they resemble those energies that are outside of us in the universe. So and Jamie was saying everything is made of atoms, and then she says, and all atoms are made of energy, and she's like, I swear, science just keeps proving magic. Yeah, like 100%. And I believe that within another 100 years, the stuff that we sit here and we debate about, and people outside of magic and witchcraft like laugh at us about or say don't exist or that's so stupid, all of this will eventually be able to be proven with science. It's just that science has not caught up to it yet. Okay. Okay, so let us move on to the next principle, and this is the principle of vibration. Okay, and as we go too, I love hearing from you guys. Like what are your thoughts about these different principles? Okay. Okay, so here is the principle of vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. So this is one of my absolute favorite laws of magic. Again, kind of proving this idea of all this energy within. The things that you look at, like the book laying on the ground here next to me, is actually vibrating even though I can't see that with my physical eyes. So things that look still are not actually still. Now, Nikola Tesla, he said, if you wish to understand the universe, he said, think of energy, frequency, and vibration. And it's a very simple way of thinking about it, but that's really what the universe is: energy, frequency, and vibration. So once the atom was discovered, we began to realize that things are not quite as solid as we think they are, and that eventually we began to understand that most of what we see is actually wide open space. And this is quite fascinating. But one of the examples I always use with my science students when we're trying to talk about the atom is if you were to go to Dodger Stadium, and we use that example here because we're in LA, but you could go to any Major League Baseball stadium, right? And if you imagine that the nucleus of the atom is at the pitcher's mound, the electrons where they end up showing up at any given point would be all the way up in like the nosebleed seats or in the far outfield, the highest bleacher that you could get to. And everything in between the nucleus and the electron is nothing. It's space. And what's kind of interesting too is that in Sanskrit, when we're talking about the 5 elements, the 5th element is akasha, and that literally translates to ether, and ether translates to space. So it's this idea of like, it's out of the ether comes creation, right? Out of space comes creation. And most of our natural world is empty space. So it's really fascinating to think about, and I get really excited about it as a science teacher, and I hope that others kind of at least have some food for thought to think about here. But then to add on to that too, not only is most of the natural world made up of empty space, but everything is also vibrating, even the non-physical. So sometimes we think about it's only the physical, or I shouldn't say the non-physical, I should say the non-living. So sometimes we think about things, oh sure, things vibrate that are alive, right? Because they're vibrating with life force. But even things that aren't like alive in the sense that we would think of it, they also vibrate as well. So our stones, a piece of wood that is no longer connected to the tree, and no longer, it's still vibrating. Like everything around us is vibrating, like your car, your book, like everything that you can look at. There's nothing you can look at that isn't vibrating in some small way. Now, what we do know about matter is that matter, at least in the physical world, is much denser than the matter in the energetic world, or pure energy that's in the etheric plane. Our thoughts, our emotions, and our intentions, though, because they are also, energy, they also carry a vibration. So this is really important for us to think about. It's like, because many people will get behind the idea like, okay, at least science tells us that matter is vibrating, but our thoughts are also carrying a vibration as well. So if you can change the vibration of your very being, you can have a profound effect on your reality. And that's really what we're talking about when we tell people like raise your vibrations. It's that similar vibrations tend to resonate with one another. So if you're resonating at a certain frequency, you're going to be attracting more things of that vibration towards you. Like attracts like, things that vibrate like you will be attracted to you. Now, denser vibrations tend to draw in other denser vibrations. So if you have a lot of denser, darker thoughts, there's nothing bad, there's nothing wrong that you're doing. But just be aware that at that space that we're in, we may not be able to be as full of potential as we can be. And so this is why there's nothing wrong with it. Like, we do get depressed. I do too. We get down, we get depressed. There's just natural things that happen to us that will make us that way. And we should be able to honor that, honor our grief, stay in that, that space when we need to, but also be thinking about if that space, if that time goes on and drags on, we need to be thinking about how do we raise the vibration of our thoughts and the vibration of our bodies so that we can draw in more higher vibrational things as well. Like, you really do have a lot more control over your reality than you think that you do, especially in regards to the vibrations that you're kind of sending out, and then the vibrations that you're attracting to you. Okay. So, I'm just going to pause for a second here. Jamie said she could talk about it all day. It really is quite fascinating. Yeah, I agree too. Glitter said everything vibrates and is connected. Kurt said if you can figure out how to break the laws, it could get very interesting. He said if I am correct, black holes in space bend or break the laws. Yeah, there are parts of the universe where the natural laws that seem to operate in other parts of space don't operate any longer. But yeah, that would be very interesting, right? I don't know what about breaking the laws of magic necessarily, but it would be interesting to see what happens when we begin to bend and kind of reform the ideas of the natural world, the laws of the natural world. Okay, so the next principle here is the principle of polarity. The principle of polarity tells us that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has a pair of opposites. So in at least in the principles of magic, at least in the Hermetic principles, there's this idea that everything can be divided into these two different poles, but there is a fluidity and a range of energies in between those two poles. So I think what's always very interesting about witchcraft and witches that I've met is we tend to be people who can see kind of past that. We don't necessarily see everything as being black and white or either or. It's like we can recognize both the black and the white, but we can also recognize the gray that is in between. And that's something that I've found in, a lot of witches that I've met, is that ability to kind of be able to see both, the either or and the space in between. Now, the real key to understanding the principle of polarity is to try to find balance. And this is where a lot of important work can get done for people as we are trying to sort of elevate our own energy, working towards our spiritual enlightenment. It always seems to return back to balance. So we can balance our own internal energy system through chakra balancing. And that can look different for everybody. For some people, chakra balancing is about targeting the chakras that have the weakest energy, or they have the blockages or the stuck and stagnant energy within them. And then for other people, balancing chakras can mean working with all 7 of them at the same time, and just checking in and making sure the energetic system is running properly. But there are other things in our lives that we also need to find balance in. And there's just some examples: work and play. Like if we're working too much and not playing enough, we're not really going to be able to tap into our inner child as well. If instead we're playing too much and we're not working enough, then we may find that we struggle with like stability and feeling secure, and it could end up having impact on our root chakra. So there's just so many reasons that we want to try to find balance within our lives, and really you could probably think about any area of your life and check in with yourself about what's in balance when it comes to that area, and what and when does that area of my life seem like it comes out of balance sometimes. So that is the principle of polarity. And we will talk in a moment, because one of the other principles of the Hermetic principles, the 7th one, is the principle of gender. And it kind of adds on to this and talks about how this manifests in the divine as well. But at least when we're talking about the polarity, it's these sort of opposing energies. And we can think about like love, versus hate. We can think about, like we said, work versus play, rest versus activity. Anything that you can come up with is going to have some kind of pole to it. And we're, at times we want to be on one side of that pole or the other. Sometimes we want to be in the space in between. But at all times, we are working to balance ourselves as best we can. Okay, so that brings us to the next principle, and that is the principle of rhythm. So with the principle of rhythm, it says that everything flows out and in, everything has its tides. And so I really love this principle because it talks to us about the patterns that exist out in the universe, right? So when we learn to recognize the tides of natural energies, we become better at kind of understanding the tides of our own lives. So, these different energy tides can have to do with the wheel of the year, like we mentioned earlier, can have to do with the lunar energies, that is more like a monthly pattern, can even have to do with the daily cycles. So it's really important for us to understand kind of the ebb and the flow of our energy, because we actually exist in a modern world that's a kind of divorced from letting people just live in the ebb and flow of their own energy, right? So, in a perfect world that didn't have a lot of obligations in it and requirements, a person who was feeling like they had a lot of low energy should be directed to rest, right? Low energy is telling us that the body is slowing down for a reason, generally to rest. Sometimes it's so that it can be in a more receptive state, so it can kind of pick up messages that are coming in from the universe or from guides or things like that. But what does our modern world tell us to do? It tells us to push through that tiredness, right? So it tells us to fuel ourselves with lots of caffeine or stimulants or things like that. It tells us to, just push through it. Work when you don't feel good. So just think about how limiting that really is to our health. And so by bringing this up, it's not like there's a lot we can do about it because we are forced to work and we can't always call in sick and we can't always take time off when we feel like we need to rest. But still, it's something that we should be contemplating. We should be thinking. So if we're tired a lot of the time, we want to try to find the reasons behind it. If it's deeper than simply we just need to rest, and sometimes a day of rest can be all that we really need. So if we can understand those rhythms of our own bodies as well, that can actually really be key, because sometimes the rhythms that are going on around us aren't the same ones that are going on within us. And so all the time I'll hear people say, when we're thinking about, let's say, for example, the lunar cycle, and when we get to the peak of the lunar cycle at the full moon, it tends to be the most activating energy. It is the most activating energy of the cycle, and it tends to be for many people. But there are also people who feel very tired and depleted at the full moon. And so those people who are on kind of like feel like they're on a different cycle would be very wise to study their own cycle and to try to really listen to it. And what you may find by tracking your kind of energy over a few months, you may find that every full moon that happens to you. And maybe you have a lot of energy around the new moon or around the dark moon or around the first quarter. But we would never know any of this if we weren't paying attention to our natural energy. So, the other thing too, I think that's wise and worth mentioning here is that with the ebb and the flow of the energy, sometimes we live in a world that makes us feel that we have to like go, 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 and we have to have thoughts and ideas, and we have to, move them forward into manifestation. And sometimes we're in a planning stage. And so for me, I had like all this anxiety that was building up within me for a couple of years before I started Body Mind Witchcraft and then eventually Shadow Seekers. And it was this energy that was like, you should be doing something. You need to do this. You need to do this. And yet, like, I wasn't like energetically, I wasn't in the right space. But I would let like that my thoughts that were kind of like, you should be doing this, were, kind of like ruling everything, and they were causing the anxiety because of the conflict between my thoughts and what my energy was actually doing. And then one day the energy shifted, and once it shifted, it was so easy to do what I had to do. I started the group, and from there it began to grow. And so I think if we'd be very wise, especially if we're people who have a lot of plans, is to be okay with kind of that ebbing of our energy. The kind of pulling back is often telling us to reflect, to think, to go inward, to contemplate. And if we use that energy instead of pushing against it, like I was always feeling like I was, because I was feeling so anxious, then life just becomes much more simple, and we enjoy it so much more. So just some food for thought. Um, Okay, so let's see here. I'm just going to look in the chat here, and then we'll go on to the next principle. So let's see. Jamie said the way that she had this explained to her was the light and dark. They are opposite sides of the same spectrum, and dark is only the absence of light. Yeah, and so and we talk a lot, like in Shadow Seekers, about our shadow, right? And there's the light side of us that is really just the visible side, and then there's the darker side of us, which is our shadow. And it doesn't mean it's bad in any way. It's just like Jamie said, it's just opposite sides of a spectrum. Colleen said she's been hearing more and more about gray witchcraft, and she said it makes sense to me, perfect balance. Sabrina said the balancing act is making sure to listen to the body and not to get overwhelmed. Yeah, exactly. And it's not easy. It's not easy, as we all know. But if we can try to be okay about those periods of our life where there is ebb and not always flow, right? The movement forwards, movement, it can sometimes feel like movement backward, but really what it is just telling us to like pull back our energy slightly so that we can study it internally a little bit better. Um, okay. Andrea said horses are great teachers in this, matching energy, changing energy. Yeah, it's always really interesting to also study energy of animals, of your pets or your familiars, your animal companions, animals that you see in the wild and nature, and watch them how they work with their energy. It's much different than us, right? There's no like wondering about. They kind of naturally know when they're in that ebb period and when they're in that flow period. Okay, so next principle, it looks like we're only going to make it through the seven, so there will be a part two to this episode, which is great. That's fine. But it gives us more time to, talk about this rather than rushing through everything so quickly. Okay, so the next one is the principle of cause and effect. And in the next episode, or I don't think it'll be next week, but in the part two of this episode, we'll be talking about the principle of synchronicity, which is kind of an offshoot of the principle of cause and effect. So here in the principle of cause and effect, it tells us that every cause has an effect and every effect has a cause. Nothing happens by chance. And that's why this connects to the law or the principle of synchronicity. So many things may seem coincidental to us, but they have to have a cause somewhere. The cause may be a magical cause, or one that has to do with, spiritual energy. It may be a mental cause. It may be a physical cause. It may be a cause that has more, that kind of exists in more than one plane, but the cause nevertheless, right? So the effect of one cause can also then become the cause of another thing. And this just continues a chain of events. And the interesting thing as well is that all energy returns back to the source. And if we look at the natural world, one of the things that we notice is that the inertia of the energy's pathway or its travel, and basically inertia is another word for the energy of motion. It adds extra energy to the intention. And so that's kind of the beautiful thing about our own intentions, right? So whether we're only using the principle of mentalism, where it's just kind of thoughts in our mind that are directing the energy, or we're using the principle of correspondence as well, where we're bringing in correspondences or other objects that vibrate with that energy, or concepts that vibrate with that energy. Whichever pathway we've taken, all of that energy gains inertia on its travel out to its, you know, its not source, I guess the receiver, where whatever the receiving end of our energy is. So whether that's sending out energy to heal someone, or sending out energy into the universe in the name of a specific intention, it gains energy as it moves. It also can make the effects more widespread as more energy gets added to it. Now, it's important for us to kind of remember that energy can become amplified on its way out of us. And there's really it's not a moral code, it's not a right or wrong to it. It's just simply what the principle tells us when we dissect it to its very core. Now, it's probably where an idea like the threefold law would come from, and the Wiccan Rede is this idea that energy returns back. And so we're not going to get into a debate about that, but I do think that a lot of people who really despise the threefold law don't fully understand what it means. To me, at the core of it, it's about a return of energy. I shouldn't even say a return of energy, but a creation of more energy, and which goes back to this principle of cause and effect, and the idea that energy gains inertia as it moves. So I think where this also is interesting to think about too is that, so let's say we do something magically, or we do something in the mundane world, and it becomes a cause that affects another thing, and see how it gains energy, and then that effect becomes another cause as it gains more energy, and it begins to move through this sort of like domino cascade of events. But another way that we can also think about it too is when we combine our energy with other people, So whether we're doing rituals online or we're doing rituals in person, when people are sort of raising energy around the same kind of thought, that cause becomes even bigger, which means that the effect becomes even bigger. And so it's really can be really quite interesting to think about how just one simple intention can gain so much energy through the principle of cause and effect. Now, in the part 2 of this episode, we'll talk about the principle or the law of synchronicity, which tells us that, I won't get totally into it tonight, but basically tells us when we can't seem to find the connection between one cause and an effect. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. It could just be that we can't see it. But sometimes there will be things that happen to us in synchronicities that don't feel like there's a cause and effect pattern. And that's kind of what Carl Jung talks about when he talks about the principle of synchronicity. It's like things that happen to us that have deep connections and that we have connections to, but maybe there isn't a cause and effect. And that's kind of what he proposes. So we will be talking about that more in the part 2 of this episode, as well as a bunch of other principles as well. And then I just wanted to end with the principle of gender, which is the 7th of the Hermetic Principles. And this principle says gender is everything. Everything has a masculine and a feminine principle. And this is quite an interesting principle to me because from an esoteric perspective, which is where these principles come from, the either or of gender seems to be more of a modern concept if we think back to where these magical principles come from. Like I said, people trace these back to Hermes Trismegistus. This is going back into more ancient times. I have to do a little bit more research on him to find exactly when he is supposed to have lived. But these are not modern principles that we're talking about right now. They've existed for a long time. And in the Hermetic Principles, I think that when we dig down into this one, it's also worth mentioning about ideas in the Eastern texts as well about things like this. So, for example, I've studied a lot of tantric yoga as a yoga teacher. And people who have come to some of my meditations or breath work, like we work with both energy channels of the body. It doesn't make a difference what gender we might identify as. We all have a masculine and a feminine energy channel, and we work with both of those in order to find true balance. So I kind of this particular principle also can connect us to the idea of deities, but again, even a deity that is like a form of the divine feminine or a form of the divine masculine, the principle of gender tells us that all things contain combinations of these two energies. So some food for thought, for your consideration, and something interesting to think about. But that is the 7th of the Hermetic Principles. So I kind of open this up to you guys, which is your favorite of the Hermetic Principles? Which one do you think is the most useful to you in your magical practice? A lot of people will probably say the law of correspondence has a direct connection to how we work with our magic. But any one of these and the entire set of them together can be so important for us. So in part 2, we will be talking about more laws of magic, including the law of synchronicity. I'll just tell you some of the other ones we'll look at in part 2. The law of association. We will talk about, what else? The principle of sympathetic magic. We will talk about the law of contagion. We'll talk about the law of triplicity, which is another really important one to witches, and the law of symbolism, and several others. And so those particular, the 7 that we talked about tonight, again, like I said, these are the 7 Hermetic Principles of Magic. They are a set that was published in the Kabbalion. But these other principles and laws that we're going to talk about in part 2, it's not quite as clear as to where the source comes from as it is with the 7 Hermetic Principles. Nevertheless, you will find them gathered together in many witchcraft books, including, like I said, from Isaac Bonowitz's Real Energy to Christopher Penzak's, I think it's the Inner Temple of Witchcraft, but it might be the Outer Temple, to, I'm sure I saw it in some of Raven Silverwolf's books. So it could be, you'll find it in many introductory witchcraft texts, these different principles and laws. Okay, so I hope that that was interesting. I hope it kind of opens up some, some things for you to think about. And of course, we'll have part 2 coming up as well. So I'm going to open everything up now for the Q&A. And so I don't really have a lot of questions for the Q&A today. I have a couple that we're going to talk about, but anybody who's here live especially, feel free to put questions in the chat. It doesn't have to be about the principles or laws of magic. It can be about energy work, shadow work, witchcraft, anything. Put those in the chat, and that goes for you in replay as well. You can also leave questions, and I will go back later and I'll answer those. But let me now address 2 things that came up, kind of were specifically left for in the thread that was about this live today. Okay, so there was a question from Michael, and he said that his question is about being recently diagnosed with PTSD due to childhood trauma. He said that in itself apparently has been causing great difficulties in my life that up to this point I wasn't even aware that were happening. He said, I thought it was just that I was living a life of misfortune. Of course, until he realized, the connection to the PTSD. So he said, is shadow work involved in the recovery of something like this? He said, I'm already seeking therapy, but it's just my question is if shadow work helps in healing from PTSD. So a very good question, and one that's very much relevant to many people, I'm sure, because I know that there's many people who follow us that are also diagnosed with PTSD. Yeah. So, okay, so let me just tell you a few thoughts on it. So first of all, I think it's great that you are seeking therapy. I think that shadow work very much can complement therapy. And I tell people, especially if you have a lot of trauma and you think it's pretty deep, I would try to do both of them if it's possible to do both. Sometimes it's not always possible, but if it is and you have access to a therapist, then I would personally do both. Now, one of the things about shadow work that it's important to note is that when we dive into the shadow, sometimes we dig up things that we weren't aware were there. That's essentially what shadow work is going into the unconscious and figuring out how we are being unconsciously kind of motivated to do certain things or to think certain ways or to continue patterns in our lives. And until we realize what the root cause is, we continue, we may feel like we're getting better. We may put a little it may feel, we're putting a little Band-Aid on it. And then all of a sudden we realize that there were levels of it that were left unhealed. And that's something too that many of the people in our Shadow Seekers membership discover, is that when they dive in and they start doing their shadow work, they're like areas of their life that they thought that they had completely recovered from or they'd completely kind of healed and moved past sort of rear their heads again. To me, it's because that person has done some really good work and they are now at a level where they can face this at a deeper level to do even further healing, which is, of course, what frees us and allows us to move more towards that pathway of enlightenment and spiritual evolution. So I think that with PTSD, one of the things you have to be aware of is that it can trigger things, and this is why having a therapist can be really good if you think that a lot of things are going to come up. But otherwise, shadow work can be very good for helping us dig down deep into the source of where some of this comes from. And another thing is, like, kind of depending on where your PTSD comes from, if it's childhood PTSD, what you will also find is working with your inner child during your shadow work can be very helpful, because the inner child, suffered those hurts, still exists within you in that way. And as you begin to befriend that inner child, you have this powerful ally on your shadow work journey. But I definitely, I think that shadow work can complement your therapy and helping, to heal your PTSD. The other thing that I recommend people do who are digging deep into their shadow work is pairing it with energy work, which is why we do that in our Shadow Seekers membership, is to give people tools that they can use when the tough stuff comes up. So breath work that they can use to kind of calm themselves when the deeper, darker emotions are surfacing and they're feeling kind of triggered by those. Doing, energy work to kind of move stuck and stagnant energy out of the body. Doing things like that can greatly help you. Meditation, yoga, the breath work, kundalini energy work, things that are just going to help aid your body and your etheric body, which is like your energy body where your chakras are, help to aid that also in clearing and healing from this trauma. And then the other thing I wanted to mention before I forget, and now I think I've already forgot what I was going to say. I already forgot what I was going to say. But I guess on a related note, too, with your PTSD, when the emotions come up from your, whatever you're experiencing, it's also wise to consider what part of your body you feel those emotions in, and then that can direct you towards a chakra that you can also do some work around, and that can help in the healing as well. And then the final thing I was going to say is, like, I really resonated with something that you said in the question, which was that up until the point of becoming aware that trauma, was causing, problems in your life and difficulties, was that said you weren't even aware that it was happening. You thought that you were just living a life of misfortune. And that is one of the things that when we are kind of being controlled by the shadow, it can feel like our lives are out of control. It can feel like things are being done to us, like we have bad luck. So like a lot of people who have, feel like they have streaks of bad luck. A lot of times it can be, underlying issues in the shadow that can be healed, and that starts to change that energy. So I think that I'm glad you found the group. I'm glad you find the shadow work guide. Reach out if you have any questions. You can check out on our YouTube channel, Body, Mind, Witchcraft, and we also have a lot of videos there on some of these topics. Okay, and then one other thing here I just wanted to mention. Kurt had brought up an article about 200 people who were massacred in Haiti as voodoo practitioners, and they were reportedly targeted because they were voodoo practitioners. So I don't know a lot about the story other than what Kurt sent me, but I did want to bring it up because he wanted to talk about it here. I think that it is, a difficult world that we live in, obviously. You've heard me say that before. I think it's, at least from what I understood about this story, is the leader, his son was either got sick or died, and he blamed voodoo on that, and so he's targeting these people. And, it's a terrible tragedy. I don't know, other than learning more about it, what we can do, but it's important for us to be aware of, injustices that are done to people based on religion. And I think as those who, the majority of our followers are in the U.S., so I'll just speak to that. But like for people in the U.S., kind of be aware of, gratefully, we don't have things like this happen. But there are people who would like to make the country a one religion country. And that isn't our religion, guys. So I think we all know that, right? So, just being aware of that and making sure that we understand that, and we're voting to make sure that the country doesn't become a Christian nation, because things like this happen in places where there's one religion, or the leader is only involved in, only believes in one religion and targets others. So thankfully, we live in a country that was founded on separation of church and state, so let's make sure we keep it that way, right? So, but terrible what is going on in Haiti. I wish I knew a little bit more about it, but at least Kurt had sent this article here. If anybody wants to look at it, it's in the comments on this post. So, okay, let me see what else is here in the chat. A lot here. Okay. So Rebecca said she feels this and she's struggling to keep her energy up because of it. Like because of the PTSD. Is that what you feel? Um, Elizabeth said, is there anyone on YouTube that you would recommend for beginners yoga? I personally loved Brett Larkin is her name. I would go find her. She's my teacher. I've done a lot of trainings with her. She's fantastic, and she has a YouTube channel with lots of free stuff and much of it for beginners. Her name is Brett Larkin. Let me see if I can just reply to it. There, I think it replied correctly. Okay. What else is here in the chat? Zabrina said her shadow work has helped with her PTSD from the past, and she said it does come back. However, I can heal it better, and that is a good point to make too. Is that it's not something that we just kind of heal overnight or heal once. It's like we heal it, we feel better, we move on, and then we may learn. We get to a more evolved place, and then we learn that we're ready to go back and heal it more. But it's a good point she makes. Like you feel like you can heal it better each time. Rebecca said it definitely helps, doesn't go away, but it gets lighter and it doesn't last as long. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay. Yeah, people were talking about religious genocide in the chat. Yeah, it's just horrific. Okay. Glitter was saying if you need, she said come to yoga with Aislin, and then we do yoga in our Shadow Seekers group on Wednesdays for anybody who joins that group. Okay. All right. So I am going to. You guys have a few more minutes to put anything in the chat you want to. Let me just tell you what's coming up. So here's what's on the schedule to come up. There's we're coming to the end of the year. There's a lot going on. So next week on 12/17, we're going to have an episode on Yule and winter solstice magic. So that will be about 4 days before the solstice. It'll give you some ideas about what you can do to celebrate the solstice on that actual day and beyond into solstice season. On 12/21, which is the Saturday of that week, so it's not this Saturday, but next Saturday, we're having our winter solstice ritual. This is our ritual Odin and the Wild Hunt. And it's a fantastic ritual. We did it last year. Every year we do it, it changes a little bit. If you are in our Shadow Seekers membership or you are part of Coven of Midnight's Flame, you guys come to that. It's part of being part of those two groups. But if you're not part of those groups, you can join us and watch for some posts and some emails later this week where we'll give you an opportunity to join us at that ritual if you would like. And it's one of our favorite rituals. It was very popular last year, so we're really looking forward to it this year. So look for more information soon. And then I'm not sure what to do because the following Tuesday is Christmas Eve, and the following Tuesday after that is New Year's Eve. So I think I'm not Christian. I think I'm just going to continue to go live both nights. At least on Christmas Eve, I'm going to do an episode on holiday self-care. And then on New Year's Eve, since it's early enough here, I'm thinking about doing a New Year's Eve ritual or like some kind of a magical working for the episode of Ask Aislin for anybody who wants to tune in and do some kind of New Year's Eve magic with me. So at least that's what I'm planning. And then at the beginning of the year, that would be part 2 of the laws of magic. We will finish the second part of this episode. Okay, so those are the things coming up, and I look forward to seeing you at some of them or all of them. So I will see some of you in the Shadow Seekers membership. Others I'll see next week at our live. If you like what you hear, make sure to add a heart or a thumbs up somewhere in the video so we get this out to the feed of more people. And also subscribe on our YouTube channel, Body, Mind, Witchcraft, and that way you'll make sure not to miss a single episode in the future. All right, until next time, blessed be.